In the final years of the Second World War, a silent race was being fought not on the battlefield, but in the laboratories and minds of scientists. It was the race to unlock the destructive power hidden inside the atom. The United States had the Manhattan Project. Germany had its Uranverein, or Uranium Club. The difference between victory and annihilation could have depended on who reached the atomic threshold first. But what if Germany had succeeded? What if, instead of the Enola Gay over Hiroshima, it had been a Luftwaffe bomber carrying an atomic weapon over London, Moscow, or New York? To understand this scenario, we must return to the early 1930s, when nuclear physics was still an unexplored frontier. In 1938, German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann achieved nuclear fission, splitting uranium atoms and releasing immense energy. Their discovery was interpreted by physicist Lise Meitner, an Austrian Jew who had fled Nazi persecution. Ironically, her calculations provided the theoretical foundation for what would become the atomic bomb. By 1939, as Hitler invaded Poland, the implications of fission were already clear to physicists across Europe. Albert Einstein, himself a refugee from Germany, co-signed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt warning that Nazi scientists could develop a weapon of unprecedented destructive power. That letter sparked the beginning of the Manhattan Project. In Germany, meanwhile, the Uranverein began under the supervision of Werner Heisenberg, one of the most brilliant physicists of his time. The project had talented scientists, but it lacked organization, resources, and, perhaps most critically, the undivided focus of the Nazi leadership. The regime viewed nuclear research as uncertain and slow, diverting funds instead toward conventional weapons, the V-2 rocket program, and jet fighters. Still, the idea of a German atomic weapon was not impossible. Imagine a different chain of events. Suppose Hitler had recognized the potential of nuclear power early, around 1940, and ordered full priority to Heisenberg's team. Suppose Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments, diverted resources from the V-2 program to nuclear enrichment. In this alternate timeline, uranium mines in occupied Czechoslovakia and Belgium would have been stripped for fissile material, and research centers in Leipzig and Berlin would have expanded into dedicated atomic facilities. Heisenberg's theoretical reactor, the Uran machine, would have gone critical by late 1942. Once the Nazis had a functioning reactor, the next step, producing weapons-grade plutonium, would only be a matter of time. German heavy water experiments in Norway, sabotaged in reality by Norwegian resistance, would in this world proceed without interruption. By 1943, Germany could plausibly begin accumulating the material needed for one or two atomic devices. If that had happened, the consequences for the war would have been catastrophic. The Allies' invasion of Europe might never have taken place. Hitler, with a functional atomic bomb, would have had the ultimate weapon of deterrence. Strategically, the first target would have been Britain. London was already within range of German bombers. A single nuclear strike on the British capital in 1944 could have decapitated the British government, destroyed the command structure, and perhaps forced Churchill to seek terms. The blast would have annihilated the heart of the city, Whitehall, Westminster, the Admiralty, and killed hundreds of thousands in seconds. But would Germany have used the bomb so decisively? History suggests that Hitler's regime, built on violence and intimidation, would not have hesitated. The Führer had already ordered the destruction of entire cities through conventional bombing. Coventry, Rotterdam, and Stalingrad bore witness to his disregard for civilian life. Possessing an atomic bomb would only magnify that ruthlessness. In this alternate scenario, once London was obliterated, Germany would issue an ultimatum: immediate surrender of Britain or further destruction. The United States, still developing its own bomb, would face a critical decision: whether to retaliate with conventional war or accelerate its nuclear program at all costs. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union would face the most immediate danger. Hitler's obsession with destroying Bolshevism could have made Moscow the next target. A single atomic strike on the Soviet capital in 1944 could have killed Stalin and paralyzed Soviet command. The Eastern Front might collapse. German armies could stabilize along the Volga or push further east unopposed. Even if only 1 or 2 bombs existed, their psychological effect would be immense. The Allies' unity would fracture. Churchill's Britain might fall. Stalin's Russia might be decapitated. Roosevelt, facing a potentially nuclear-armed Reich across the Atlantic, would shift American resources entirely toward countering the new threat. Nazi propaganda would call it Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon that would secure a 1,000-year Reich. The moral and psychological balance of the war would tilt overnight. Technically, Germany already possessed delivery systems capable of reaching enemy cities. The V-2 rocket, with a range of over 300 kilometers, could deliver a small warhead across the English Channel. Had it been fitted with an atomic device, London could have been destroyed without a single bomber taking off. From 1943 onward, Allied intelligence would likely detect signs of atomic research. The strategic bombing campaign would shift from industrial targets to scientific ones. Facilities in Leipzig, Hamburg, and Vienna would become top priorities. However, if the Germans had already achieved a functioning bomb, the Allies might not have time to react. Consider Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. In our reality, success depended on deception and weather. But in this alternate timeline, if Germany had a bomb by that time, it could have destroyed the invasion fleet as it massed on the English coast. A single detonation over Portsmouth or Dover could have annihilated tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of ships. The invasion would have been impossible. The world would wake to a horrifying new reality. Nazi Germany, not just dominant, but armed with the most powerful weapon ever created. In response, the Manhattan Project would accelerate beyond any historical pace. Los Angeles, Oak Ridge, and Hanford would operate around the clock. The U.S. government would divert all available uranium and plutonium to weaponization. But if the Germans struck first, especially against London, the political pressure for retaliation would be overwhelming. By early 1945, the United States might have a functioning atomic weapon of its own. Yet the question would no longer be about victory, but survival. If Germany controlled Europe and held atomic dominance, could the U.S. realistically invade? Probably not. The Atlantic would be a nuclear barrier. Instead, the world might enter an early form of Cold War, an uneasy standoff between a Nazi-controlled Europe and an American hemisphere preparing for mutual annihilation. With Germany in possession of an atomic weapon by late 1944, the world's political and moral landscape would have changed overnight. The Nazi leadership, Hitler, Goebbels, Himmler, would see it not as a weapon of deterrence but of domination. Their ideology was rooted in total conquest. The bomb would not have been a symbol of peace through fear, it would have been the ultimate tool to enforce a twisted vision of racial supremacy. The question is not whether Germany would have used the bomb, but how many times. Unlike the United States, which debated for months about the ethical implications of dropping the atomic bomb, Hitler's regime had no such restraint. The Holocaust, the destruction of Warsaw, and the total war doctrine of 1943 showed that Nazi Germany had already accepted mass civilian death as legitimate strategy. If the first bomb destroyed London, the second would likely target Moscow. Hitler viewed the Soviet Union as both ideological and racial enemy. A nuclear strike on the Soviet capital would have wiped out Stalin and the Soviet General Staff. Without leadership, the Red Army might collapse, giving the Wehrmacht a chance to consolidate control over Eastern Europe. After the fall of Moscow, the Nazis could dictate terms to both East and West. The Third Reich might expand from France to the Urals. Occupied territories would become sources of uranium and labor, fueling continued nuclear production. Germany's scientists, supported by forced labor and unchallenged industrial capacity, could produce several more bombs within a year. The world would face the birth of a nuclear dictatorship. Instead of post-war reconstruction, Europe would be frozen under Nazi rule enforced by atomic terror.
Resistance movements would vanish. Cities would live under the shadow of instant annihilation. Across the Atlantic, the United States would enter an era of fear and preparation. The Manhattan Project, already the largest scientific endeavor in history, would become a national obsession. President Roosevelt, or after his death, President Truman, would authorize a crash program to produce deliverable nuclear weapons within months. But the American bomb, when ready, would face a moral dilemma. Could the United States justify a nuclear strike against Germany if it meant killing millions of civilians? Would it be self-defense or revenge? The Manhattan Project scientists had warned about this very possibility. A nuclear arms race where the first to strike sets the rules of destruction. If Germany bombed London and Moscow, the United States might retaliate against Berlin, Hamburg, or Munich.
The destruction would be total. Yet Germany, already entrenched in its ideology, might respond in kind. Atomic warfare could spiral rapidly beyond control. Within weeks, entire continents might burn. The global balance of power would collapse. The United Nations, born in 1945 to prevent exactly such a catastrophe, would never exist. Instead, humanity would face nuclear stalemate before it ever knew peace. Technologically, Germany's atomic program would evolve faster under wartime pressure. Scientists like Heisenberg, Karl Wirtz, and Kurt Deibner could develop more efficient designs once the basic principles were proven. Using forced labor from concentration camps, uranium enrichment plants might appear across occupied Europe, perhaps in Silesia, Austria, or Norway, near sources of heavy water and power. Politically, Nazi Germany would exploit its nuclear monopoly to reshape the world. Neutral nations like Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain would fall into Berlin's sphere. Italy, long a junior partner, would become dependent on German protection. Japan, fighting in Asia, might receive technological aid, creating an Axis nuclear alliance spanning 2 oceans. By 1946, the world could consist of 2 nuclear powers, Germany and the United States. But in this timeline, Germany would already have used the bomb first. That act would define the future. Had Hitler lived long enough to see his bomb succeed, he would proclaim it as proof of Aryan superiority. Yet history might still turn against him. The same weapon that gave him victory could ultimately destroy his empire. Atomic technology could not remain secret forever. Within a few years, other nations would catch up. Eventually, a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Reich would be inevitable. Berlin might strike first, targeting New York or Washington. The U.S. would respond in kind, obliterating Berlin. Europe would be reduced to ash. Civilization, as it was known, would collapse under radioactive clouds drifting across the continent. The victor in such a war would inherit ruins. Crops would fail, cities would burn, and survivors would live in poisoned lands. The dream of a 1,000-year Reich would die in less than a decade, consumed by the very weapon it had unleashed. But perhaps the greatest tragedy would be moral. The post-war world of our reality, the one that emerged after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, learned restraint through horror. Humanity saw what one bomb could do, and for 80 years avoided using another. In the alternate world where Germany dropped the first atomic bomb, that lesson might never come. The taboo against nuclear war would not exist. Instead, the use of atomic weapons would become normalized, an accepted method of victory. Future conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East might all have seen nuclear strikes. The 20th century could have become an age of radioactive battlefields, not cold diplomacy. There is one more dimension to this scenario: science itself. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon. It was the key to understanding the universe. In our world, post-war nuclear research led to medicine, energy, and space exploration. Under Nazi rule, those same discoveries would be twisted toward control and extermination. Science would lose its moral compass. Einstein once said that if he had known what his theories would lead to, he would have become a watchmaker. In a world where Germany developed the atomic bomb first, that statement might not have been metaphorical. It would have been prophecy. By 1950, the world would be unrecognizable. A Reich stretching across Eurasia, armed with atomic weapons, suppressing dissent with the threat of annihilation. The United States, isolated behind its oceans, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Humanity, living under the shadow of total destruction decades before the real Cold War ever began. And yet, perhaps, inevitability would still find its way. The same internal corruption, arrogance, and cruelty that defined the Nazi regime might still lead to its downfall. Atomic weapons could not save a system built on hate. Eventually, rebellion, sabotage, or simple human error could bring it all crashing down. In the end, the difference between victory and extinction in the atomic age was not just technological, it was moral. The question of who developed the bomb first mattered less than who understood its consequences. If Germany had built the atomic bomb before the United States, the world might not have survived to tell the story. The line between history and oblivion was not just by chance, but by choice. By the decision of one nation to use knowledge for survival and another that would have used it for domination.